To install the piston rod assembly correctly, we want to get our journal at the bottommost point of the block, as we have done number 1. At this point, we can proceed to install number 1 piston rod assembly. Final preparation of the cylinder walls is accomplished by taking a few squirts of clean oil, applying it to the cylinder. We're going to use paper towel to wipe the inside of the cylinder with this oil. We're using paper towel specifically because it has a very low lint content. We're going to take our piston and rod assembly, and first we're going to install the rod bearing into the rod. In the same fashion we installed the main bearings into the mains. Once again, rocking it back and forth until we have it symmetrical in the cap. And this time we can install our crankshaft savers that we use during disassembly to make sure that we don't mar the crankshaft with the rod bolts. Now we want to coat the bearing with our oil, put a nice coat on it, and we can take the piston and rod assembly and install it in the bore, but not all the way. Just get the skirt caught in the bore so it'll stay in the block in this fashion. If you recall, there's 3 rings on the piston. We have the oil ring, which is one furthest from the top, and the 2 compression rings, being the second or lower compression ring, which is second from the top, and the top compression ring. We want to take our oil ring, and if you recall, it's made in 3 pieces. You have the expander and the 2 side rails. We want to take the expander, the actual end of the expander, and place it at this location. The 2 side rails, we want to be in this area and this area, approximately 90 degrees apart. The lower compression ring, we want to have its gap in this area, just offset from center and to the front of the block. And the top compression ring, we want dead center toward the center of the block. This will assure us in having a best ring location for the particular application we're working on, which is a small block Chevy. We'll have different ring gap locations on the even side of the block. Keep in mind, with this ring location, we're working on the left side or the 1, 3, 5, 7 side of the cylinder block. We also want to thoroughly load up the ring area on the piston with oil. To do this, we can take our oil can and saturate the area where the oil ring is, and by holding up your other 2 rings, you can get oil actually underneath them, between them and the piston. By holding the rings with your fingers and keeping the piston from moving, you can now rotate the rings back and forth without losing your positioning from one ring to the next, spreading the oil around the whole ringland area. Now, by relocating them where they belong, where you initially set them, and just double checking our location, we're ready to use our ring compressor to finish installing our piston assembly. There are several types of ring compressors on the market. We're going to use our old tried and true band type. We simply take it, expand it, bring it over the piston and up against the top of the block, and hold it square by using light pressure over the top and pushing toward the block. Taking a small ratchet or the Allen wrench that comes with the compressor, we're going to tighten it down, and as it starts getting snug, we're going to want to hold the ring compressor to keep it from spinning. We continue to snug this ring compressor till we have adequate resistance on the wrench. We don't want to force this. This piston has to be able to slide through the compressor into the cylinder without the rings binding excessively in the compressor. We want to make sure that the piston is held with the rod perpendicular to the crankshaft. We can tell this easily from the top by noticing our location of this dome or valve relief on our pistons. If you have a question of where the rod is located at this time, you can always look up under the block by the crankshaft and actually see the rod. Now we're going to take a small hammer. You can use a block of wood or any soft device, and we're going to gently tap the piston into the bore. Once the piston is cleared the compressor will close up. Now we can remove the compressor and pay attention to the rod as it tries to connect with the crankshaft. Now we can finish pushing the rod toward the crankshaft, and also by holding your hand in this manner, we can make sure that the rod never contacts the crankshaft and just the bearing. Now we can remove our crankshaft savers. At this time, we should take special notice of our rod bearing position. If we look at the bearing, which is this thin line right here, and the cap, we also want to make sure at this point that the bearing has not shifted and become unsymmetrical from one side to the other. If it is, at this time, we must compensate for it by gently pushing the rod bearing back into place, making sure it's symmetrical with the ends of the rod. Now we have to insert our other rod bearing half into the rod cap. We do that in the same manner that we've been putting all the other bearings in. We also want to coat this bearing with engine oil, as we've done here, and install it onto the rod studs with the bearing tang slot in the cap lining up with the same bearing tang slot in the rod. Or we can also go by our reference numbers that we originally stamped on the rods. They should be on the same side. We've already lubricated the threads of the rod bolts with oil, so we can go directly to installing the nuts. We want to draw the nuts up lightly on both sides before adding any real pressure to our wrench, gradually increasing the amount of tension on the nut. Now we can use our torque wrench to torque the nuts to the proper settings. Once again, we get our torque specs from our engine manual. You never want to pull a rod nut to full torque in one shot. You want to go back and forth from one to the other, breaking down the amount of torque in segments of at least 3 intervals. Now that we've torqued our rod nuts, we want to check for free movement by moving the rod back and forth. Ours moves freely. We can also at this point now, by taking the wrench that we bolted to the end of the crankshaft, rotate our assembly once or twice, see if we have any binding. You should feel some light resistance due to the fact that the rings are now rubbing against the walls of the cylinder. This assembly feels good. Also at this time, it'd be beneficial to remove the cap, and just like we did with our main bearings, use plastic gauge to double check our rod bearing clearance. Once you've rechecked your bearing clearance, it's time to install number 2 piston rod assembly, which is going to share this journal. Now we move to the passenger or the right hand side of the block, and we're going to install piston number 2, which is the one closest to the front. Once again, we've already put our bearing on, we've installed our crankshaft savers, and now we're going to show you the ring positioning for this side of the block. This being the front of the block, we're going to the expander for our oil ring to be in this location, the 2 side rails to be here and here, approximately 90 degrees apart. The second compression ring, we want our gap to be in this location. The top ring over here. As before, we're going to thoroughly coat all the rings and the ring lands with oil. And once again, now we're going to rotate them all together to spread the oil throughout the ring land. Double check our ring position. And install the ring compressor as before. Repeating the procedure we used on number 1 piston, we'll gently tap the piston assembly in, off, and we can continue now to lower the piston in the bore. About an inch down from the bore, we want to start taking notice of the crankshaft side. At this point, we want to make sure that number 1 rod is as far over to its side as possible, giving us the most room we can achieve to bring number 2 into place. Also, as number 2 is slowly brought down into place, we want to again line the cap up with the side of the crankshaft, making sure that it's perpendicular to the crankshaft. We also want to maintain the rod being away from the existing rod as much as possible so that we will not incur any interference between the rod being installed and the rod that is already installed. To do this, we usually come in and gently hold our crankshaft sabers and continue to bring the rod closer to the crankshaft. When we get very close, we want to double check all of our alignments again in case they have shifted. Now we can continue and finally install the rod completely. As we did with number 1 rod bearing cap, we've inserted the bearing in the cap. We're lining up the cap as we did in number 1 and have coated the bearing with oil. We install the cap as far as it'll go by hand. Now we'll install the 2 cap nuts. Once again, we bring up each bolt lightly and evenly. Always remember, never fully torque one nut in one shot. Always break down the amount of torque into at least 3 equal segments and move from one to the other. Now that we've torqued our rod nuts, once again, we want to check for side movement, making sure that it does move freely. There won't be very much movement now because we have both rod assemblies on the journal. On the Chevrolet small block engine, specifications call for a minimum of 10 to 20 thousandths maximum clearance between the rod assemblies. Before we measure that, let's first turn the engine once or twice to check for any binding. And now we can check with a feeler gauge for our rod side clearance. It's a simple procedure of just inserting the gauge down between the rod caps and changing from one size gauge to the next until we find out what our actual clearance is. At this time, it is also wise to remove number 2 rod cap, as we did number 1, and by using the plastic gauge, double check our bearing clearance. The same procedure should be followed throughout installation on all remaining piston rod assemblies. As we add more piston rod assemblies to the crankshaft, it'll take more effort to turn the crankshaft. That is why after each assembly is installed, the crankshaft should be turned at least 2 revolutions to check for any binding. If after installing any rod piston combination and you have any binding, you should remove that assembly and correct the problem.